Good evening and welcome to the fourth edition of our Terrestrial University. Tonight is a very special occasion, so thank you to everyone who is tuning in and joining on the Telegram chat. Bruno Latour, philosopher, sociologist, and curator of Critical Zones Observatories for Earthly Politics, is with us to expand on an essential concept of the exhibition, the notion of the terrestrial. So Bruno, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And you're joining from Paris, right? So we won't hear any crickets in the background, unfortunately. Okay. We're missing them. And also joining the exploration is Peter Weibel, Chairman and CEO of the ZKM Karlsruhe. Herr Weibel, you have spent your entire day in a video conference already. So I admire how you do it. You're hosting an online symposium as part of the Angewandte Festival at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. So yeah, it's really impressive, and thank you for joining as well. And as I mentioned before, tonight we will explore the concept of the terrestrial. And Bruno will share some of his thoughts in a short lecture, and Peter will then react to them in the end. And you at home are very welcome, as usual, to join the conversation on Telegram, and I will do my best to give your questions a voice. So, Bruno, as a possible starting point for the venture, the journey, I wanted to offer a very short quote from your book, Down to Earth, in which you introduce the concept of the terrestrial with a capital T. You write, quote unquote, "For the terrestrial is bound to the earth and to land, but it is also a way of worlding in that it aligns with no borders, transcends all identities." And I thought that could be a nice quote to start you off. And yeah, we'll be listening. And thank you so much already.
Thanks, Barbara. It's very nice to be here. And hello, Peter. Very nice to have the two curators together. On the other hand, with Zoom, people work much too much, because now you can be everywhere all the time, and everyone is using this possibility now. And I'm, of course, very pleased to be talking in the Terrestrisch Universität, because I didn't know that it was possible to do it, and you're right to use this name, which I will try to maybe more define more precisely, even though it's still, of course, work in progress. So I have about 6 points which I want to make for the discussion. I mean, just to start the discussion, of course. And if I'm too long, Barbara, you just do this and I will stop. The first point is that you cannot reach the terrestrial at once, because it is the place that you reach when you have realized that you were actually off in some other planet, so to speak. And in the catalog, which I will use as the beginning of this little lectures, we actually move by successive stage from a position which is the place where we were when we were modern, so to speak, when we were progressing to other futures of abundance and prosperity, so to speak. And the first, of course, step in this slow descent to the terrestrial is disorientation. And the disorientation is, of course, what do we do with the change of climate and viruses and so on. So we don't know yet, but we sort of feel that there is something which is highly out of joint in the way we understand where we stand, so to speak. And including, of course, the huge conservative movement toward identity, which is, of course, one of the answers to this crisis of land, so to speak. The second step is the sort of more precise definition of a disorientation, which could be called disconnection. And the disconnection in the catalog and in the exhibition takes a very precise meaning, which is we live on the land, Germany, France, Holland, etc., but we live off another land, which is not as visible and not as well defined as the one we live in. I mean, this is clear from colonization. It's clear also from the use of coal and gas, the extraction, all of those places far away in space and far away in time, which are providing us with ways of life. It's true, of course, of international commerce and so on and so forth. So the terrestrial is when you begin to ask the question, how can I begin to reconcile those two lands, so to speak, the one I live in and the one I live from? And of course, it's a powerful answer to the conservative revolution going on, because when people talk about the identity of Germany or the identity of Poland or the identity of Italy, etc., they speak only on one, the even very narrow definition of the land they live in. But the land they live from is completely ignored and even less visible than it was before. Then we begin to land again by slow movement. The first, that's the title of the exhibition, is critical zone. Critical zone is a way to describe not nature, not the planet Earth, but just the tiny, tiny little fraction of it, or thin film, which is the one in which every living entity ever lived. So it's an interesting cosmological prime. We always talk about the cosmos, about nature, about the planet, but we actually live only in this little things which has no representation. And actually our show and our catalog is the first time that you stress and emphasize this little sort of superficial thing. And of course, the fourth one, I mean, when we want to make more clear definition of a critical zone, we get into this very contested term, which is Gaia. And Gaia is the same thing, but where the question of life forms and what they have been doing to transform this critical zone is underlined. So it's very interesting to see that when you move from critical zone to Gaia, you gain into realism, so to speak. You begin to talk about earthworms, you begin to talk about all sorts of things, and how they have transformed their environment, so to speak, since the 4.5 billion years. Of course, bacteria are very important in it, and so on and so forth. So you begin to realize that the whole, what people used to call environment, that Umwelt, is actually made by living form. But Gaia is not yet, not a political entity. And that's where you get into the terrestrial. The terrestrial is the same question, critical zone, Gaia, but with the politics in it. So that's the first point. And now that we are sort of landing on Earth, which is the subtitle of the book, of the catalog, now that we are landing on Earth, we have understood that we cannot go on in the planet where we were sort of escaping until now. The first thing is that, so now, if I define the second point, is terrestrial is what you see of where you live when you don't consider it from the outside. So the whole notion of the Earth viewed as a planet, as a globe, as a blue planet, as a blue marble image, etc. It was also the theme of the exhibit we did together with Peter a few years back, Reset Modernity. This is exactly where you miss what the terrestrial is, because the characteristic of a terrestrial is that you are in it. So any view which tries to sort of impose the geographical grid on it misses many of the points that the terrestrial is actually about. So if you want to understand the terrestrial, is ask yourself, how do I describe where I land from the inside, and not as foreigners coming parachuted, so to speak, from above. It's exactly the opposite of a GPS. It's exactly the opposite of Google Earth. I mean, we might disagree with this with Peter, because Peter loves those things, but I think they engage into a certain attitude toward the the planet, which is precisely misleading. The third point is that it's and that's a more philosophical characteristic of a terrestrial, is that the living forms, bacteria, trees, elephants, humans actually, are the actors that have produced space and time. And that's very different from the grid, which is the supposed grid of geography, accounting, cartography, which has been a sort of a Cartesian coordinate. Inside, you put points. The point that we are familiar, the pixel that we are familiar with the GPS. In the terrestrial, it's a point that Donna Haraway made very clear when she was talking at the opening of this exhibition, is that every entity is actually building, so to speak, its own space and time. An earthworm, a migratory bird, a river, a house, an architect, etc., and so on, are not in the same space and time. Every one of them is actually building and have its own metric, so to speak, that has to be respected if you want to move in the terrestrial. Which also means, of course, that the terrestrial is difficult to describe because there is not one single metric that says, here you are in Karlsruhe, here I am in Paris, here is my identity, and here's your identity, and it's finished. You have to be much more aware of the interconnection between these beings, which leads me to the I forgot maybe the characterization of a fourth point, which is, of course, the great argument developed in the catalog and in the show with, as you know, we give a lot of influence to Lynn Margulis, who was one of the inventors of Gaia, but who died, unfortunately, very early. And she's interested in something which is very well characterized by Donna Haraway as interspecies. So all of the relation we establish with other species, famously, Donna Haraway worked with a famous dog. Fortunately, the dog died, Cayenne. And that thing worked with mushrooms. We now work, all of us, with the COVID-19, which has a very strong influence on all of us. So we have interspecies relation, which were not allocated and not framed, so to speak, in a very clear way before. So basically, the move to the terrestrial is a move where human asks the question, how many non-humans are simultaneously cooperating or, on the contrary, making my life difficult. Mm-hmm. COVID, again, is a good example. But we are not going to get rid of the COVID. We are going to live with it, and with many of the other viruses, which are actually good viruses. So this interspecies definition of ourselves, it starts with my skin, it starts with my stomach, it starts with all of the entities necessary to live. There is a powerful example that, for instance, cows, when they are born, don't have the right stomach to eat the grass, and that they need microbes in the stomach who are actually sculpting, engineering the stomach of cows so that they can digest grass. And it's a very beautiful case of what Lynn Margulis called holobionts, because the holobionts is the organism plus all of the other organisms sort of not only in the organism, but overlapping with it. And that's a characteristic of a terrestrial, it's this overlapping. And again, the tragic pandemic in which we are still involved is a very nice case of that. Because suddenly you realize that you have plenty of viruses everywhere and that you have to live with them. So it's a bit hard to get, but it's a very important one. The next point, which is, I'm listing some of them, but there are many, and in the catalog there is actually almost a third of the catalog which is about that, which is more complicated to get. and totally opposite to the modernism that we inherit from, is what Anna Tsing calls, it's not scalable. The whole modernist ethos, the whole, how should I say, drive, when you do an invention or when you build a new system or invent a new tool or a new market, is it scalable? Can you move from this innovation to everybody? Like, famous example is, of course, Apple. I mean, start in a garage and it's end up in everybody's hand. So that's a big thing, scalable. The problem with terrestrial, it's not scalable. It's actually every single point is different. And it has its own, again, space and time, but also its own specificity, so to speak. So it's very difficult to transport the tools which have been used to survey the land in the classical externalist position to the terrestrial. Because every time you survey by hand, so to speak, or by foot, the terrestrial, you have to do it basically millimeter by millimeter. And of course, this is one of the reasons why we give so much prominence in the show to critical zones, observatories. And observatories is the subtitle of the exhibition. Because what we realize is that if you begin to look at soil, even if it's, I don't know, I mean, kilometer square, like the one we choose for the demonstration, almost every meter of it, every centimeter is a problem for the scientist of a critical zone, because the dynamic that includes viruses, bacteria, earthworms, clay, water, all of the Mendeleev table of chemical, etc., is raising a specific problem. So you don't have a sort of chessboard where you have a grid and then you say, well, okay, what is true here is probably true there. No. Every time I've been to many of these critical zone observatories, and basically when you walk with these scientists, they stop every 2 meters. And they say, oh, that's interesting. I have no idea what you could do with that. Look, it's very surprising this year. And that's why they have all these instruments which try to keep time and as many information as possible. Because in fact, that's what I realized working with them. We know very little about the way the Earth critical zone is working. And what is even more interesting in the case of a scientist of a critical zone that we pay homage to in a way in the exhibition, is that simultaneously they are in the laboratory, and here they have all the big machine and the whole instrumentarium of physics and chemistry at incredible levels, actually. As you will see in the show, I mean, some of the data which are produced in the critical zone observatory are actually much more precise than many of the things that physicists or chemists study normally. So it's what I'm interested in here is the balance between highly specific pixel by pixel problem raised by the critical zone and a very powerful instrument using all of the available sciences. And I think that's a very original way to look at the Earth. That's, I think, is a characteristic of a terrestrial. And of course, because we need the sciences to survey pixel by pixel, observatory by observatory, what the planet Earth is actually made of. Now, of course, the next one, which is slightly more practical and which is big outcome of this exhibition in what you do, Barbara and many others now do, which is to shift attention not only to the specificity of a place, but to what I call self-description. That is, because we were in this land of a modern land, which in a way very far away from the critical zone and from Gaia and from the terrestrial, we have difficulty describing ourselves. So we position ourselves, I mean, no one has time to put the GPS and say, well, I'm here, and send a millions email to the people saying, I'm here. Barbara is here, or Bruno is here, or Peter Weibel is here. But that's not a description of where you are. If by where you are, you take the terrestrial definition, which is what is making you subsist? I mean, what are the entity with which you actually have to, that you have to cherish and protect in order to live? So, and of course, these entities are other humans, but as I said, they are other species as well. So there are a whole range of other entities making you live. And this question of self-description is a character of a terrestrial. In the terrestrial, people are not using GPS. They are saying, they don't say where they are. They present themselves as, I am the one who is actually supported or by those entities or destroyed by those entities. And with many people at ZKM and in Paris, we have actually invented a whole series of sort of, I mean, almost sometimes games, serious games, but also practical dispositif to actuate this situation of self-description. So it's not, this is my identity card, this is my longitude and latitude, but this is where I subsist because of all this entity in my back, and I am attacked by all this entity, and I need to decide what I'm going to do, which we call the compass. And if people who are listening to us are coming to the show or subscribing to the self-description, the questionnaire, as it's called, they will have to do this. It's important because that's a characteristic of a terrestrial. And of course, this sounds a lot like what anthropologists and ethnologists know about other cultures. In other cultures, you don't say, this is my name, this is my identity card, and this is my longitude and latitude. You say, I live off this series of entities, sometimes divinities, sometimes land, sometimes animals, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, going to the terrestrial is where we are. So that's about my first, it's not a map of the terrestrial, but, and I'm sure that Barbara will understand that I cannot draw a map because a map will be using the grid and the sort of typically modernist way of grasping a land from the outside. But indication, the show is actually only that. I mean, pointer to help, as the show says, to land on Earth, and as the catalog says, to have an earthly politics. And an earthly politics is very different from what politics was when we were moving away and hoping to escape from the conditions of the planet. So this is my best definition so far.
Thank you so much, Bruno.
You will notice that I was exactly in the 20 minutes which we mentioned.
It's incredible, just, yeah, and it was so concise. I mean, everybody has been following you on this vast exploration of the term, and the beautiful thing about this term is that it is, it is open for thoughts and ideas. So like you said, right now, you gave us an indication, a pointer, but for me, it's like really, it's an invitation also. It's an invitation for shifting, for a shift in thinking. So thank you so much. And I would like to give the word to Peter. Peter, do you want to react to what Bruno just said, to some points, and maybe point out what you thought was most interesting about this indication?
Barbara, just one question.
Yes.
When I translated the book in German, people say, well, Terrestrische is not really German, it's a bit odd. Now you like it?
The Terrestrische, for me, it's such a wonderful term.
Okay, good.
I really love it. I've fallen in love with it completely.
But now it's the name of a university, so
Yeah, yes. I think the entire team, when we were thinking of how to name this the series, we were really thinking, and then sometimes at some point everybody said Terrestrische Universität. So there you go. Thanks.
I thank you, Bruno, to be with us. And I agree with Barbara. She made a wonderful explanation in the 6 layers and 6 dimensions of the term terrestrial. I would like to continue to make it even more precise when we by comparing the term terrestrial with other historical classical terms. So I have some questions. For example, I would say we have the general term of earth sciences. And now I would say Gaia is a subsection of the general term earth sciences. And I would say your term terrestrial, which is a kind of neologism, therefore people in Germany have doubts. But I think too the term terrestrial is very precise. But could we say that your concept of terrestrial is a subcategory of general earth sciences, or is it something completely different?
Well, Earth system science is a polite term used by scientists to avoid the word Gaia. So it's actually euphemism.
Okay.
But because Gaia, invented by Lovelock and developed by Margulis, has a lot of other layers. One of them is, of course, mythical. I was working this afternoon with a specialist of Greek Gaia. All of them are very interesting, actually. And I think it's fitting that such an interesting and important shift in science be called with a name that is itself a mythical term. But of course, in polite society, even Tim Lenton, who is the best student of Gaia, says, well, I'm an Earth system science, because ESS looks perfectly straight. So it's not a question of subset, it's just that it's another term. Now, on the terrestrial, I think terrestrial is not a scientific term. It's a pointer to a change of epoch. So it's not. It uses lots of science from the sort of the normal definition of nature and physics and chemistry, but it switched them to a question which is very different, and because it has a political dimension, as we discussed many times when inventing this show and in the catalog. So it's not a domain. It's another way of seizing and grasping where we are. It has a cosmological dimension.
Herr Weibel, if you allow me, there is a question that goes directly to this point from Telegram, from Tiese Riemersma. She said, or he, I'm sorry, could Bruno perhaps explain in what way the terrestrial is a political articulation of Gaia? Yeah.
That's a very interesting question, because Gaia, even in my own rendering, we try to be as close, so to speak, from Gaia as a scientific concept. Because if not, it's immediately used as Mother Earth, superorganism, and all these things, and then it's lost. So the other thing, of course, is that the politics of Lovelock is completely rotten. So to associate Gaia with politics would be very difficult, because Lovelock doesn't have a clear idea about his own politics. In a way, it's a very reactionary type of politics. So I think we should divorce that. Gaia is, in this context, I mean, the context of the show, is the scientific exploration of a great discovery, which has been simultaneously favored by the use of the word Gaia and hindered in a way. Politics is, of course, the question of assembly. How do we assemble to take care of those entities which we now realize are so many, so little known, and so important for our survival? I mean, of course, some of them are very big. Climate, but climate is the result of the activity of bacteria and trees and clouds and all sorts of things, and humans. So to be very precise to this very important question, the terrestrial is Gaia, so to speak, plus the question of assembly. And this question of assembly is, of course, what we try to do with the show, because the show, after all, will be a workshop to have people assembling precisely self-describing themselves using the compass that you have been drawing. And in some ways, on many of the topics, as a scale model, of course, we are not assembling the Earth in ZKM, but we do little scale. We do like we always do with Peter. We do exhibition, which are small scale of problems, gigantic problem, but which cannot be studied otherwise.
I think the question was very good, because correctly, the terrestrial is a political formulation of Gaia, because Bruno adds to this question precisely the political concept of assembly. This is what I mean at the beginning. Bruno
we did a great show together.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
In 2005, we did a great show together, Making Things Public, which was about assembly, and Gaia wasn't there yet. But
exactly, and now and now he's adding the concept of assembly, a political category, to a so-called biological category, because holobions means, in fact, Gaia was, up to Bruno, more or less a biological concept. And what is very important that you taught us, Bruno, in fact, the Earth system science is a subcategory of Gaia, because Earth system science does not include James Lovelock and not Margulis. Therefore, it's the scientists.
Because in fact,
now we have a mix.
Well, in our catalog, we have a very nice chapters on the history of Earth system science, which is very largely due to Lovelock's work. So, not the word, word, but the genealogy is clearly that Lovelock was immensely influential on the idea of Earth system science, not on biology. Biologists ignored entirely Gaia because it was disturbing from the definition of the organism. But Earth system science, people would have no difficulty saying Lovelock was very important.
Yeah, but precisely. So normally we have Earth system sciences without a political dimension like assembly.
That's the point. Naive politically.
Yes, exactly. And now we see, now comes also Bruno, who is older years, said he was speaking parliaments of things, and even parliaments of animals. And when we made our show, he said, what is the voice of the river? How is the river represented? He asked, democracy should not only be a representation of people, it should also be a representation of other beings. And now this comes together. This idea of assembly is not only an assembly of people, it's also an assembly of non-humans. And therefore he's changing and expanding the idea of Gaia, of biology, because it turns as a sociologist into political sociological dimension. And this is the innovation what Bruno is doing.
You speak to me as Bruno. Okay, yes.
I speak to you as a historical figure.
It's very interesting because, in fact, it's a pity that we cannot republish the catalog of Making Things Public, because, in a way, in 2005, we were way ahead. And everything we assembled, which was an assembly of assemblies, and of the mechanism to make the parliament of things and make things and non-humans or more than humans work, it's still completely up to date, and it's still at the forefront of research. So ideally, we should mix the show of 2005 with the show of 2020. We should republish the catalog, Peter.
I think you convinced me now, Bruno. We will republish the catalog for sure.
It's exactly the question. Now Gaia is here, but we don't have a mechanism to make it have a voice. And in a way, in 2005, we invented lots of voices.
And what is very important, as you said correctly, we have been very far ahead, because about 10 years later, two best-selling authors, Interactors, Tony Negri, and the other one published a book called The Assembly. So even 10 years later, this idea was taken up, but not fully understood, because for them, assembly was just without Gaia. That was just state another political concept. No? But we wrote about but you wrote about it totally different, but they took the title of assembly. No? Anyway.
Multitude, I think. Barbara, you have a question.
There might be a question that goes in that direction also, or picks up from there. It's from Alexander, and he says that they have been discussing a lot in the last few weeks, and they were asking the question: is the development of the terrestrial possible in capitalist regimes?
No. Of course, the prime is there a capitalist regime. I mean, this is the prime that capitalist regime is one of these words that cover the whole planet with a huge bowl or dome, which renders everyone under it without any power. So I would say no, of course, and with the argument, with the idea of a capitalist regime, because if you look at every issue of a terrestrial, it's precisely the disconnection and the contingent and makeshift nature of this famous capitalist regime, which is visible. I mean, look at the pandemic. I mean, who would have imagined that the capitalist regime will suddenly have a hiccup and stop for a few weeks just because of a tiny, tiny little virus? So the prime with this situation of a prime, so to speak, when you bring capitalism in, nothing happens after that. Don't forget that capitalism has been used for the whole 20th century from the left, with the only result that it has expanded, it has witnessed the expansion of capitalism immensely. So my attitude here is to say, well, why would you use a term which has been so deficient in arming the left for a century to try to cope with the problem of the 21st century? So I think we should leave capitalism aside. We might want to use regime, as I use it actually as a climatic regime, and then do exactly what is being done on the terrestrial, which is fight, but knowing where you are to fight and against whom. And this is the problem of space. If you don't specialize, can you say that? Specialize, put in space and specify who are your friends and enemy, which is the object of a self-description. Talks about capitalism is always a way to make people even poorer and less active. So the only way to empower people is to start with the self-description. And it's a very important point, which I could develop. But the rule is, the less you talk about capitalism, better you can act politically.
Noted.
I would like to continue what Barbara has said
Your microphone seems to have a problem, Peter. Maybe
You need to drink something, Peter. We don't hear you.
Yeah.
Better now? No.
No? That's
You sound like a frog or something.
Do you come again? Try it again.
1, 2, 3.
No.
We had problems also before.
You sound like a robot. It's really interesting.
You're always difficult to understand, but here nothing is understandable.
I will quickly ask our technical team to send some support.
Okay.
Maybe can you unplug it and plug it in again? Your the cable, you know, if you follow the cable up all the way, not there, but just follow the cable.
Maybe you need nothing. Maybe you take the thing off. But maybe we have more questions, Barbara.
Better now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you. So what Bruno is doing, he's opening up concepts into other spaces. We have just discussed how he opens a biological concept of Gaia to politics. But he did also something interesting. When he speaks about that we now learn, we live in one territory, but we don't live from this territory. We live from other territories. This is what normally is called trade. The trade always knew we have to trade because something is growing here in Italy, which does not grow in Germany, or doesn't grow in Scandinavia. But this knowledge that we are living off from other countries was just an economic knowledge. So the trade was just an economic definition that we live from other countries. Now Bruno adds, no, it's more than just economy. It's also ecology, and it's about nature.
Right.
Bruno, right?
Right, and this is very well put, because of course we know international trade is necessary for one country to live. I mean, think of Holland in the 16th century. I mean, 17th century Holland. It's a very small land, and it lives from everywhere. We sort of know that, and of course now we realize that we are trading, so to speak, or we are using. Not only as resource, but as agent, many other entities from the land, which we associated before with nature. So that, you're perfectly right, that's a big change. But there is another difference between the world we live in and the world we live from, which is with a very nice chapters in the catalogue by Pierre Charbonnier on that, is that the world we live in has a legal right. People who are in the world of Holland have a legal right. They know where to sue, where to vote, and so on and so forth. But the land we live off. I mean, the animals which are being brought, or the corn which are being brought, or the soybean which are being brought, they might have some sort of legal visibility in their land, but not for us. So this is the problem, that we sort of care for the place where we are, because it has visibility and rights, but the other is largely invisible. And you are perfectly right, Peter. The economy as a science, I mean, international trade is very important, but not the rest. The rest is not made visible by economic at all. And this is why post-colonial study are so important, why the whole work of militant to denounce some trade is so important. But you're right, trade is one of the visibilization, so to speak, of this double. So when we do the exhibition, we try to say, okay, yes, we live here, but we also live from this. Can we try to make the two somewhat superimposed, so to speak?
Exactly. But the point is, Bruno, the trade was without ecology and without politics, because we exploited people. Colonial and post-colonial, we exploited people.
It's not good at, it's not.
And we exploited the territory, we exploited the land. Yeah? Huh?
Right. I mean, the present dispute around the rights and the slavery and so on are typical of that situation.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are actually two questions in the chat that point in that direction. I'm going to read this one out from Noelia. She says she's asking from Latin America, and she asks, precisely, it's actually what you have been saying. How can we think about politics in the critical zone, provided that there are a variety of existences that do not fall under the traditional European political forms, and yet are perhaps the ones that are being the most affected by the global warming and global annihilation of whole biodiversity? To say it in another way, is the key a form of communication of practices and worlds possible, and how?
Well, that's a big question. It's a very difficult question, because of course we have to recognize, especially in Europe, that globalization has global effect. But the solution to this global effect is not itself to answer in a global way. And this lady is perfectly right. But in a way, globalization, especially Europeanization, has always been small elements which never actually completely erased or completely destroyed thousands and thousands of other ways of living. This is what I call in the book globalization plus, which is not the same as globalization minus. Globalization minus is the extension of the network of a standard everywhere, which is probably what the lady, the question says is globalization, but she's perfectly right. But the question then for practices, exchange of practices, is actually a nice way to define terrestrial. Mm-hmm. Because the terrestrial cannot rely on a universal. Terrestrial is not universal, because it can become maybe as an horizon universal, but it means that every single little practices has to be connected in ways which are ad hoc. And of course, that's connected with something which is very important, not so much in the show, but in many other shows, which is the sudden, what I call the contemporaneity of First Nations, so to speak. It's very interesting. First Nations everywhere in America and Latin America were supposed to be past and even passé, and suddenly realize that, as Vivero de Castro says, they are our best teachers to survive now. So the same cultures which were in our back as an example of our past, suddenly say, you are contemporary. Oh, wow, that's a word. You are well, you see what I mean. You are up to date, and you are exactly at our own. You are timely, if you want. We need to learn from you, because as Vivero de Castro says, you are the expert in resisting disappearance. And he just published a small book on that. I mean, it's a very tragic line, but it's unfortunately very true. So to answer technically the question, yes, terrestrial is actually allowing the practices to connect in a way where you cannot have a universal sort of principle expanded like the West believed they could do it. And suddenly we say, no, it's not the West. It's a very tiny definition, European definition of a universal, but there are obviously many others.
Well, it calls for an exchange of practices and worlds, right?
Yes, I think that's perfectly. It's a very nice definition. And you said there was another question.
Yes, from Oliver Graf, and he said, colonialism introduces a separation between the country and the colony. How do we deal with such separations that seem to stand in the way of landing on Earth? What kind of decolonization does it imply? And he made it short with, is there a terrestrial decolonization?
That's beautiful. The terrestrial is the result, very much so, of a decolonization, and especially of post-colonial. I've just published a paper with Dipesh Chakrabarty exactly on that. I mean, without post-colonial studies, and I should say anthropology of the modern, because for me they are the two, one working on the modern, one working on the others, we would still be in the European illusion about the universal future. So decolonization and pointing at the basically, to speak in terms of post-colonial, is pointing at the terrestrial, which is exactly another discipline which I like a lot, and which is doing the same, is what is called not global history, but connected history. Many people in France and the US do connected history. That is realizing that every time you mention a European great achievement, you realize that there's been many others before. And actually, the whole dispute about statues right now is exactly on that question. So everybody feels that because of the climate question, the reconnection of the land we live in and the one we live from, or as this question very rightly said, the nation and the colony, the whole question of migration and the whole question of racism and slavery has to be reworked. I mean, this is completely obvious. You cannot, but with the addition, which is not often pursued always by post-colonial study, to add the more than human in it. And that, of course, something which is more disputable and a source of dispute inside the post-colonial study. I mean, it's not only human and slave, it's also the whole living forms which have been destroyed and exploited, so to speak. So, yes, it's a very beautiful question and very nice way to describe the terrestrial. Are you rewriting all those questions, Barbara, or you have an amazing staff of
No,
people?
I've got, yes, the staff is there as well. I've got my cell phone. I'm taking notes.
That's amazing, because during the 3 days of the opening of a show, you manage amazing questions.
Yeah, well, it was thanks to the, the discussions were just so amazing. So it's really not difficult. It's, I actually have a question for Peter from yesterday, if I may, yes. Because yesterday I had a really interesting conversation with Johanna Zipritzky, who was part of the HFG seminar that you gave, Bruno, in preparation of the exhibition. And we were talking about the terrestrial, and she asked me, and I would like to pass this question on to you, Peter. What does it mean for an institution to assume terrestrial responsibility?
Wow, that's a big question, Peter. I'm glad it's a question to you.
She asked me, and I was like, okay.
Okay. Well, I could say a museum, as a ZChem, is not a museum. No? We are a museum. Normally, a museum is defined collecting artworks and presenting artworks. So it means now collecting artwork means to take care that artworks do not disappear. Normally things would disappear. So it means conservare and curare. We have to take care that works done by human people do not disappear. So it's more than collecting. But now ZChem is called center because we are a museum, but we're also a research center. And this is precisely, as a research center, you have a key concept which Bruno wrote about, the laboratory. So he wrote a book, Laboratory Life. And I would say, okay, a museum is just a conservation place. But ZChem is a center, that means it is a laboratory. And it has to make explorations. It's a cutting edge. And it's an initiative. As a museum director, as a director of a center, of a research laboratory, you have to learn what is the cutting edge now. In life sciences and earth sciences, etc., are now at the moment the most important cutting edge sciences. You can discuss it politically, you can discuss it artificially, artificial life, artificial intelligence, etc. So what we do is precisely the whole scope of cutting edge sciences which are centered on life sciences and earth sciences. This is my interest. And this can be called part what we started in the 60s. We called it expansion of art. The art expanded from the object to the process. And now suddenly, and this is, for example, an author which is discussed since a long time, Whitehead, discussed by Bruno, discussed by Isabel Stengers, and I read it too in the 60s because I was interested in the process, not in the product. I made many actions in the 60s saying precisely the process is more important than the product. So many ideas came together from this idea to expand art into the economic, political, and social domain.
Funnily enough, it expands to the earth, but in the terrestrial, this expansion is not like this. It's actually an expansion
deepening
in intensity.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very difficult point to make in the show because it's not about covering many stuff. It's actually getting into. This is why we start with one single observatory. I mean, it's not. It's the specificity which is back, so to speak.
Thank you, Bruno. In depth and intensity. But I would have, can you continue, two small questions also to Bruno. We started to make differences between his concepts and old concepts. And he invented also the neologism called earthly politics. And I would like to discuss with Bruno shortly, what is the difference? And there's a difference between the classical called geopolitics. We know geopolitics, and now we have earthly politics. I would say the difference is that geopolitics was just, again, about people. No? How so politics was not about the change of the land and it was more how people could conquer geography. Bruno, how you would make the difference?
Well, it's interesting. It's complicated because geopolitics is interested in land and sea and borders and flood.
But in a very different way.
But it's you're right. It's entirely oriented to a definition of the Earth This is why it's called geopolitics and not Gaia politics. It could have been Gaia politics, but I prefer the word earthly because it's not the same earth. When I talk with geopoliticians, they take the earth as a sort of a checkerboard, and it's a board on which the only agents which are at work are the humans. I mean,
exactly,
not all humans, but powers.
Exactly. Populated only, so Earth only populated by humans. This is a difference.
They know that there are limits to the chessboard, to the powers' activity, because there is a river here, a mountain there, or a source of coal here, and a source of oil here. So they are aware that there are all these resources, but the agent is the human. And of course, with the new climatic regime of the Anthropocene, I mean, the thing has become more complicated because the geo, which is Gaia, is itself reacting to the action. So earthly politics is a nice word in English. I don't think, I'm not sure I invented it.
German is impossible. No? German is difficult.
It doesn't work. Well, you have lots of other traditions, of course. Some of them are interesting, like the one on Carl Schmitt, but disputable politically or ethically. Still, I mean, it's all about round. I mean, it's the whole question. It has a right version, but it has also a lot of left version. And it has a terrestrial version, which is neither right and left, but precisely it's not the same land. And every question of traditional politics is different.
I think you did a good answer. So your earthly politics is just Gaia politics instead of geopolitics. That's a good idea.
Remember in the 2005 show, Making Things Public, we use realpolitik.
Mm-hmm.
And realpolitik was supposed to be realist, but in fact, it's not realist at all. It's actually very idealist, as Isabel Stengers says. What counted before as realpolitik is actually escapism now. It's getting out of the earth like Trump does, or Bolsonaro, or whoever. And earthly politics or Gaia politics is actually looking down. And I just want, I want to answer the question about Joanna's question. Now that I prefer that it's Peter because he is responsible, I'm not, but I think for the show, we have a responsibility, which is to transform the place in an assembly actually it's your responsibility, Barbara, in a way, because you are in charge of that.
Not all by myself. There's an
well, not by yourself. Okay, we will help. We will help you. But I mean, basically, the idea is that there is a show, and then the workshop is actually all of the workshop is assembling something around it, which mimic or explore or scale down questions which are the politicization of Gaia. I mean, which is what the terrestrial needs.
I have another question to Bruno. Globalization promised us a globe without borders. But now with the coronavirus, the border started in front of the house. So there's this famous novel, Xavier de Mestre, Voyage autour de ma chambre. No? So right. Globalization promised us we can travel around the world all the time. Yeah? But now we have learned, no, you cannot travel at all. You can only travel in your own room. Voyage autour de chambre, so the border starts in your house. Therefore, Bruno, many people speak now about deglobalization. Yeah? And one answer is, which I think is a wrong answer, renationalization. Yeah? But maybe we can make a balance between deglobalization and relocalization. What do you think, Bruno, in terms of earthly politics?
Well, that's a very complicated question because simultaneously the pandemic, it did separate us. We couldn't even go to Germany to ZKM to celebrate the beginning of the show. Yeah. So we were cut off. But simultaneously, the small viruses produce a global transformation everywhere. So it's very paradoxical. Everybody did the same thing and everybody separated one another. So the result is that we have here, and I think you are perfectly right, have a model or not a model, but at least, how should say, a hint that there are many other ways of mixing globalization and localization, because that's what exactly happened. It's a bad example, but it shows that the choice is not between being global and being local, because as you very nicely said, we were stuck. I was stuck in this office for 2 months. And it's obviously relocalization doesn't mean abandoning many of the networking. The proof is that we're actually on Zoom, and now I'm sure, Peter, you give talks to everybody elsewhere. So it's not a relocalization, it's a redistribution of those terms. I think we should actually completely abandon global and local, because it means nothing. Okay. When you do this exercise of description, of self-description, people are all over the place. And it's not that they are here or there, it's when you begin to describe what you live from, what makes you live, what you make you subsist, this is where you are. I mean, are you in New York or are you in Karlsruhe? It makes no difference. But what makes you live is the key. So I think because of the viruses, we learned a lot about alternatives.
I think it's a good phrase. The choice is not between global and local, and therefore we should not use deglobalization or relocation.
It would be clarifying not to use this term.
Yeah, very good.
Good.
We are slowly approaching the end, but there are still many questions on the chat group, and I would like to kind of shift the conversation back to the living beings, the critters, the earthbound, as you would say, Bruno. And it's another question by Johanna, actually, and she says, I'd suggest a little provocative to include Donna's and Deepesh's emphasis on care as the 7th point. My question is, are all non-humans terrestrials? How do we recognize non-human terrestrial care?
Are all non-human terrestrial? Well, I mean, if they are on the critical zone, the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. If they are in the middle of the planet Earth, the answer is no. I mean, it's a very interesting question in terms of a limit of a critical zone. Actually, it's discussed every day in scientific journals, because it turned out that the people were saying it stops 3 kilometers down when you are in the undisturbed rock, so to speak. But now they find living forms everywhere, very deep down in amazing depth in South Africa, especially. Of course, I will cite the wrong numbers, but so the question of a limit, and of course it's true up too. I mean, we find bacteria up there very high. What is sure is that it's still limited, so to speak. But it's a difficult question. It's an empirical question. Where is the limit up and where is the limit down? But it's on the critical zone. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, it might be in other planets. We have no proof of that yet. But if it's on other planet, as Lovelock says, it's not Gaia. Mm-hmm. It might be life form, but it's not Gaia. Gaia is a highly specific entity which has molded the Earth, the critical zone. I mean, don't forget. I mean, we just published a paper with Tim Lanton, which is called "Why Life is Difficult to Detect on Earth," because in terms of size, life forms are not that much. It's actually a very interesting problem of detection. And the cosmic dimension, and if you compare with the amount of energy coming from the sun, life forms have been able to produce and to use a tiny, tiny, tiny version of that in 4 billion years. Mm-hmm. So there is nothing strange to say that there is nothing spectacularly big in life form. That's why also it's fragile. And that's why, of course, care is becoming the great notion, which is replacing everywhere in all sorts of studies and the notion of production, discovery, etc. No, everybody talks about care. And it's a very important shift.
Yeah.
Bruno, do I understand you correctly? That you said all living beings, humans or non-humans, are terrestrial as long as they are part of the critical zone.
Yeah, well, it means everybody, because I don't know if there is anything on Martian. I mean,
Yeah.
excluding Martians.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
It means that it's important to understand that we have no experience except the critical zone. I mean, it's the only experience we have. You can say, well, some people have been on the space station, but the space station will disappear in a minute without being connected to the Earth. So, no, we have no other experience than the critical zone. Everything we have experienced is there. Now, we have thought about cosmic voyages, and we can talk about the Big Bang and all of that, but it's always inside physicist department or astronomy department on Earth. This is a great, of course, a great problem for religion, actually, because the only important things are on Earth. So if you begin to talk about up there, what is your responsibility? What are you betraying? Mm-hmm. It's a huge problem of theology, and which I'm also working on right now.
You're working on this? Bruno, you're working right now on this?
Well, I'm working in...
You continue your work, Jubilee?
Yeah. I'm trying to interest, of course, the Pope, Francis, helped me a lot with his encyclic. But the way Catholic resist the Laudato Si, which is the name of his encyclical, I think it's the encyclic in English, is very interesting to me, because it's very difficult in terms of thinking and metaphors, and to say no, religion is not about. Remember, we tried to do an experiment.
Yeah.
Religion is about this, says the Pope.
Yeah.
And all the Catholics say, I mean, the Pope is mad, because if you are religious, you go up. No, you go.
Yeah. But it's strange that hell, we are coming from here, we are living from here, but religion says this is hell. Yeah? Very strange.
It's a big problem of cosmology for religious people. Yes. Don't would not have accepted that. Yeah, it's a huge problem. Well,
that's gracious.
Barbara, where are we now?
We are at the last moment. I actually, to sum it all up, because in all this and in the exploration of the terrestrial, you keep repeating that the important point is the self-description, right. and describing very precisely the dwelling place, the ground we live on. So I wanted to ask you if you could, for our Telegram community, but also everybody else tuning in, maybe name some of the most important questions one has to ask oneself to really describe one's own position. What are the most important questions?
Well, I sort of drafted them in a little article I published during the COVID lock-in, which I think is translated it's in German.
Margit translated it in German.
Margit was and did it, yes.
Yeah.
It's translated in many languages now. And the reason why it interested people, because it's not the first question, which is, what should we abandon since we have been having this experience of a lock-in? Let's stop all these things which have been stopped. I mean, of course, all of them are going back right now when we begin to forget about that. But the important question is, what do you do with the people of the activities, of the industry, of the enterprises, etc., that you want to get rid of? Because it's one thing to say, well, I'd love to stop, mass tourism. So this, well, fine. I mean, this is, maybe it's true, but what about, not only about you who want to go to Greece as soon as July arrives, or to Italy, but what you do with all of the industry, tourist industry, for people who are there, who might be your neighbor or your friend, or actually your parents or your sons. So this is the very important question. All of this ecological green stuff, so to speak, have a deficit of seriousness, if I can say that, because of the argument about capitalism, which I mentioned before, but also because it has no price to pay, so to speak. You say, well, I want to get rid of this, I want to get rid of that, I want to stop having meat, hamburger, etc. Yes, but what do you do with these people who are living off their beef or their veal or etc. So if you do the little questionnaire, which I think we now can do fairly well in ZKM as well as in Paris, this question is always the harder, the hardest, because people don't want to get into that. They sort of prefer to dream about a green world, but we cannot. We are not at liberty to dream. We need to settle, as you very nicely, to dwell. And to dwell, you need to know what makes you alive and what doesn't make you alive.
And also, it was interesting because you said to describe one's own position, you have to understand how your own position affects somebody else. Right. So I think that's the shift that is very interesting. Okay, so with this, I want to really thank both of you for this lovely conversation and this really inspiring ride, exploration of the terrestrial. Also, I want to say thank you to everybody on Telegram. It was a lovely chat. And of course,
you are amazing.
Well, you guys are, everybody is. Especially also, I want to mention them behind the camera. There is Peter Müller and Joachim Schütze, who have been our technical hosts. So thank you so much. And also to the video studio, because we learned that they are uploading the live stream festival in bits and chapters. So that will be online on our website soon. And obviously, I also want to say thank you to everybody at the ZKM who is involved in making critical zones so digitally accessible. So that's because everybody is working on it. The museum communication, the communications department, the curators, the event department, technically everybody. It's like really the entire ZKM is behind this. And on the last note,
Bruno, thank you.
Yes.
Bruno, thank you, Bruno.
Thank you.
And we are republishing, making things public. Huh?
Oh, that's good. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you for everything, Bruno. Yeah? And I see you at the end of July. No?
Yes. We have a big celebration again.
And we drink. You know what we drink.
We drink for real.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you.
Very good. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes, goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye, Barbara.
Bye. Thank you so much.